All right, so this is our second assignment in Unit 7, and today we're going to be talking about multiplying polynomials. We're going to be multiplying by a monomial and then factoring out a monomial. Factoring is kind of like division. We'll get into that here in this video. So we should know how to classify polynomials, put polynomials in standard form, classify them by the degree and the number of terms. We should be able to add them together and subtract them together. So now we're just going to get started with multiplying. So let's go ahead and get started by thinking about this. Suppose that X represents the smallest possible storefront window that you could have. You obviously, if you own a store, like in the picture, you want to have as big of a storefront as possible. So let's say you get a corner store, and along the one side you have two X's, maybe that's two opportunities for doors, and then you also have three X's going this way. So here's an X, an X, and an X, plus 5 little spaces, maybe 5 more feet. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So this would kind of be cut off and be, here's 1, 1, 1, 1, and 1. So I have 5. So this side here is 2X, this side. This side here is 3X plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so we want to find the area of your store. And so we could do this separately by finding the area of each of these individual boxes. And so we have, like this box here is X by X. Well, that's an X squared. This box here is X by X. That's another X squared. And we have an X squared here and an X squared here and also here, because all of those are X's by X's. So that's going to be a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 X squareds. But then if I take a look at this kind of rectangle here, it's X by 1. And so X times 1 is X. That's not an X squared, it's just an X. I'm going to have another X here, and here, and here, and here. Also on the bottom I'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 X's. So that's a total of 10 X's. And so if I were to find the product, that means if I multiply them together, what I would get is 6X squared plus 10X. Well, can I do that a different way? Can we do that by using the distributive property? And yes, we can. Here's how we would do that. We would take 2X times 3X. Well, the 2 times the 3 gives us 6. X times X gives us the X squared. And that's how we got the X squared. Then I could take 2X times 5. And 2 times the 5 is 10. And then I have the X. And so you can see my answer there is 6X squared plus 10X. So we can do all of these with a picture like this. That's a concrete way of doing it. Or a more abstract method would be to use the distributive property to come up with our polynomial. So let's practice some of these on our own. Let's start with number 1. And what I would do on each of these is pause the video, try it on your own, and then see if you were able to come up with the correct answer by watching the rest of the video. I'm going to do all of these by using the distributive property. So I'm going to take first 5X times 3X squared. 5 times 3 is 15. Then if I take X to the first times X to the second, remember we add the exponents when we are multiplying like bases. That's going to be X to the third. Then if I take 5X times negative 4X, that's negative 20. 5 times negative 4 is negative 20, and X times X is X squared. And then 5X times 7, the 5 times 7 is 35, and then I have the X. So my answer is 15X to the third minus 20X squared plus 35X, which, as you can see, is a cubic trinomial. Let's try another one. Take a look at number 2. Again, I'm going to use the same method. I'm going to take 2X squared times, or 2X to the third times 4X squared. So I'm going to start by taking the 2 times the 4, which is 8. And then X to the third times X to the second. I'm adding those exponents. That's going to be X to the fifth. Then when I take 2X to the third times negative 8X, 2 times negative 8 is negative 16. And X to the third times X to the first is X to the fourth. And then 2X to the third times 2, well, that's 4, and I still have the X to the thirds. So my answer for number 2 would be 8X to the fifth minus 16X to the fourth plus 4X to the third. That is a quintic trinomial. All right, so let's try some different things here. Here's number 3. I want to simplify this. I want to put it in standard form. And there's 2 areas where I'm going to multiply. So I'm going to use the distributive property in 2 different areas. But then I'm going to have to add polynomials together to get like terms. So for example, I'm going to start with this one. I'll take 3x times 4x. Well, 3 times 4 is 12, and x times x is x squared. And then 3x times 7, the 3 times 7 is 21, and then I have the x. Then when I distribute the second set of parentheses, I'll have a negative 4x times 8x, which is negative 32x, and a negative 4x times a negative 2 is going to be a positive 8x. So I'm done multiplying, but what I have to do then is combine like terms, and so I'm going to do that. I only have 1x squared, that's the 12x squared. But then I also have 21x and a negative 32x. Well, 21 minus 32 is negative 11x's. Plus I have the 8x, so I can also add that onto my original problem. It's 12x squared. Oh, I messed up here. I messed up because this should not be 32x. This should be 32x squared, shouldn't it? And so this is wrong and this is wrong. Let me go back and erase some of this. And let's do this correct here. Negative 4x and an 8x gives me a negative 32x squared. So I'm going to need to go back even more because that means I have 2x squareds. I'm going to have 12x squared minus 32x squared. That's a negative 20x squareds. That's combining these two x squareds. And then a 21 plus an 8, well, that's a 29x. And so my final answer here for number 3 should be negative 20x squared plus 29x. All right, so let's try going in the opposite direction. This is kind of like our answer. And what we want to do is figure out what could we have multiplied together to get 16x to the 4th plus 20x to the 3rd minus 12x squared. So the first thing that I want to do is figure out what goes into 16 and 20 and 12. And that's a 4. 4 is the biggest number. Now I could pull out a 2, but I think 4 is the biggest number that goes into all 3 of those numbers. Then I want to figure out what can I pull out of x to the 4th, x to the 3rd, and x squared. Well, they all have at least 2 x's. This one has 4 x's. Here we have 3 x's, and here we have 2 x's. So I can pull out at least 2 x's from all terms. And then what I want to do is multiply 4x squared times 3 things that give me my 3 original terms that I started with. For example, 4 times what gives me 16? Well, that has to be a 4. X squared times x squared then would give me x to the 4th. So when I multiply 4x squared times 4x squared, I get the 16x to the 4th. Well, what would I multiply 4x squared by to get 20x to the 3rd? Well, 4 times 5 is 20. I have x squared, but I need an x to the 3rd, so this is going to be x. And then I want to figure out 4x squared times what gives me negative 12x squared. Well, 4 times negative 3 is negative 12, and I already have the x squared there. So in factored form, my answer is going to look like this: 4x squared times 4x squared plus 5x minus 3. I'm going to have you work through this with me here. This is where we're heading with factoring. Factoring is going to be extremely important because right now we can only solve this equation with one method, and that method is called factoring. You could try to do a lot of things like subtract 20x and then divide by 5, but you're always going to have an x squared and an x, and you won't be able to get x equals anything by itself unless you can factor 5x squared plus 20x. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to take this part of it, this side, and I'm going to try to figure out what goes into both of those terms. And so I would start with a 5 because 5 goes into 5 and 5 goes into 20. Here I have 2 x's and here I have 1 x. So they both have at least 1 x in them. And so then I'm going to figure out what do I multiply 5x by to get these two terms. Well, 5x times x is going to give me 5x squared. and 5x times 4 gives me 20x. So now I have this factored expression, and I have two things that give me 0. And suppose I have two things that give me 0. A times b is 0. I want you to think about what the a and the b could be. The only way that I can get a 0 if I multiply them together is if one of them is a 0. Even negative 5 times 5 doesn't give me 0. Negative 5 times 5 gives me negative 25. And when I multiply two things together and I get a 0, that means that one of those two things, either the a or the b, must be 0. Well, in this case, I have two things that give me 0. So one of these two things must be 0. Either the 5x is equal to 0, or the x plus 4 is equal to 0. And so now I can solve both of these equations. The first one, if I divide both sides by 5, I will get that x equals 0 divided by 5, which is 0. And the second equation, if I subtract 4 from both sides, I'll get that x is equal to negative 4. And if I plug both of those numbers into my original equation, I will get something that's equal to 0. For example, if I plug a 0 in, 5 times 0 squared, well, that's 0. Plus 20 times 0 is 0, and 0 plus 0 is 0. So this one works when I plug it in. When I plug negative 4 in, well, negative 4 squared is positive 16. Positive 16 times 5 is 80. Then I'm going to add 20 times negative 4. Well, 20 times negative 4 is negative 80. So a positive 80 plus a negative 80 does indeed give me 0. And so this also makes the equation true. And so I have two solutions here. Now, this is not something that we're going to be doing on our homework for today. The only thing that we're going to be doing on our homework for today is taking the 5x squared plus 20 and factoring it. And so that's what we're working on today. You should be able to take polynomials like what we had here and factor them, and then also multiply them together.